The final signature on our divorce papers felt less like an ending and more like the first breath of clean air I had taken in nearly a decade. My ex-wife, Julia, had barely waited for the ink to dry before she went public with the man she had been secretly seeing for the last year of our marriage. She flaunted her new relationship with a cruel intensity, posting photos of them in the house I had paid for and sitting on the furniture I had worked 60-hour weeks to afford. She told our mutual friends that I was the anchor dragging her down and that her new guy, a fast-talking promoter named Marcus, was the soulmate who would finally give her the life of excitement she deserved. I didn't engage in the social media warfare, and I didn't send angry texts in the middle of the night. Instead, I focused on a relocation offer from my company that everyone else had been too afraid to take. It was a senior executive position in Singapore, thousands of miles away from the toxicity of the life Julia was building. I spent my final weeks in the country quietly liquidating my personal assets and setting up a series of legal barriers that would ensure Julia could never touch another cent of my future earnings. She was so distracted by her upcoming wedding to Marcus that she didn't even notice when the alimony payments she expected were legally diverted into a trust for our children that she couldn't access. She viewed my silence as a sign of defeat, never realizing that I was simply clearing the battlefield so she could destroy herself without any interference from me. The day I boarded my flight to Singapore was the same day Julia was hosting her engagement party at a high-end country club. She had charged to a credit card she thought I was still secondary on. She had convinced herself that she was the winner in our divorce because she got to keep the social standing in the local house, while I was being exiled to a foreign land where I knew no one. She didn't realize that the house was already on the market and that the bank had already approved the short sale after she failed to make the first solo mortgage payment she had promised the judge she could handle. I sat in the executive lounge at the airport, watching the sunset over the runway, and felt a profound sense of tactical peace. I had spent years being the stabilizer for her chaos, and now she was about to find out exactly what happens when the stabilizer is removed and the plane starts to dive. Marcus was a man built on credit and charismatic lies, a perfect match for the version of Julia that prioritized image over integrity. And I knew it was only a matter of time before their shared house of cards came tumbling down. I turned off my domestic phone for the last time, leaving behind a trail of deactivated accounts and canceled services that would hit her like a series of physical blows the moment she tried to settle the bill for her celebration. I arrived in Singapore to a life of high-rise luxury and a professional challenge that demanded every ounce of my focus. A perfect distraction from the ghost of a marriage that had nearly drained me dry. The city was a vibrant, neon-lit landscape of opportunity, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't coming home to a woman who treated my success as her personal ATM. I built a new network of friends and colleagues who valued my intellect rather than my willingness to be a safety net, and I found a quiet joy in the simplicity of a life where the only drama was the one I saw on a movie screen. Meanwhile, back home, Julia was rushing toward her wedding date with a desperate fervor, trying to outrun the growing pile of bills and the whispers of friends who were starting to see through Marcus's polished exterior. She had married him in a lavish ceremony that cost more than my entire first year's salary in my new position. Convinced that by becoming his wife, she was finally securing the fairy tale she had cheated to find. She had no idea that at the very moment she was saying her vows, a guest was preparing to deliver the one line that would shatter the illusion and send her running back to the man she had called a failure. The wedding reception was a sprawling, opulent affair designed to convince the world that Julia had finally ascended to the heights she deserved. But the cracks in the foundation were beginning to show through the expensive floral arrangements and the vintage champagne. Marcus was in his element, holding court at the center of the room and regaling guests with tales of his upcoming international ventures, while Julia sat at the head table, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she watched the waitstaff begin to whisper near the kitchen entrance. She didn't know that the credit card she had used for the final deposit had just been flagged for suspicious activity, or that the country club manager was currently in his office contemplating whether to shut down the open bar before the bill climbed any higher. The air in the room was electric with a tension that only those who live on borrowed time can truly feel, and Julia was so desperate to maintain the illusion of her victory over me that she ignored the growing coldness in her gut. She spent the evening dancing and posing for photos, oblivious to the fact that her new husband's charismatic stories were being dismantled in real time by a guest who knew the truth about his financial history. The turning point came during the traditional speeches, when a former business associate of Marcus's, who had been invited only out of a sense of obligation, stood up to offer a toast that quickly veered away from the celebratory script. He was a man who had lost a significant amount of money in one of Marcus's failed ventures, and he had decided that Julia's wedding was the perfect stage for his final act of grievance. He looked directly at Julia, his voice cutting through the sophisticated hum of the room like a jagged blade, and said with a terrifyingly calm smile that he hoped she enjoyed the jewelry she was wearing, because it was likely the last thing she would ever own that wasn't being chased by a debt collector. He told the entire room that Marcus was currently under investigation for a massive Ponzi scheme and that the international ventures he bragged about were nothing more than a series of shell companies designed to hide stolen funds. The silence that followed his words was absolute, a heavy and suffocating void that seemed to swallow the music and the laughter. Julia felt the blood drain from her face as she looked at Marcus, hoping for a defiant denial, but found only a flickering, panicked look of guilt that confirmed every word. The chaos that erupted after the toast was a masterclass in social destruction, as guests began to whisper and reach for their phones to check the news, while Julia's own family looked at her with a mixture of shock and budding resentment. She tried to maintain her composure, shouting that the man was just a bitter liar, but the damage was done and the fairy tale was dissolving into a public nightmare before the main course was even served. The country club manager finally made his move, approaching the head table with a grim expression and informing Julia that the event would be terminated immediately unless a valid form of payment was provided for the outstanding balance. She reached for her purse, her hands shaking as she pulled out the emergency card she had kept for years, but she already knew what the result would be. The man she had called a soulmate was already making his way toward the exit, leaving her to face the angry staff and the judgmental stares of the very people she had tried so hard to impress. The realization that she had traded a life of quiet stability for a world of criminal debt and public humiliation hit her with the force of a physical blow. I was halfway across the world, finishing a late-night dinner with my new team in a rooftop restaurant overlooking the lights of Singapore, when my phone finally buzzed with a notification from a mutual friend who couldn't resist sharing the carnage. I watched the shaky video of the country club scene, seeing Julia standing alone at the head table while the staff cleared the half-eaten plates around her, and I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with malice. She had wanted a life of high-stakes drama and excitement, and she had finally achieved it in its most raw and unforgiving form. I didn't send a message of sympathy, and I didn't gloat over her misfortune. I simply closed the app and turned my attention back to the conversation at the table, realizing that the man Julia had called pathetic was currently the only person in her life who would have actually protected her from the storm she had created for herself. She had burned the only bridge that could have led her back to safety, and now she was finding out exactly how cold the water could be when you're swimming in a sea of your own lies. The aftermath of the wedding was a silent, suffocating desert where Julia found herself wandering alone, stripped of the status and the security she had taken for granted during our marriage. Marcus had disappeared within hours of the reception, leaving behind a trail of unpaid vendors and a mountain of legal debt that made Julia's head spin every time she tried to read the notices appearing on her front door. She had tried to contact the lawyer who had handled our divorce, hoping to find a loophole that would allow her to access the trust fund I had established for the children, but she was informed with a cold professional finality that the trust was airtight and that her own actions had disqualified her from any further support. She sat in our former living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the ghosts of a life she had so casually discarded, and she realized that the excitement Marcus had promised was just a euphemism for the total and absolute destruction of her reputation. She had spent years building a persona of a woman who was too good for a stable, loyal husband, and now she was finding out that the world had very little use for a woman who possessed nothing but a collection of expensive mistakes and a name that was now synonymous with a public scandal. The desperation finally broke her pride on a Tuesday evening when she picked up her phone and dialed the international number she had vowed never to call again. I was sitting on my balcony in Singapore, watching the heavy tropical rain wash over the city. When the call came through, I let it ring for a long time, not out of malice, but because I wanted to be sure that I was ready to hear the voice of the woman who had tried to bury me. When I finally answered, the sound of her weeping was so raw and jagged that it felt like a transmission from a different world. She told me about the debt, the desertion, and the way the country club was suing her for the wedding costs. She begged me to come back, to help her fix the mess, promising that she finally understood the value of what we had. I didn't interrupt her, and I didn't offer any words of comfort. I simply listened to the sound of her realization that the bridge she had burned was the only path to safety she ever really had. I told her with a calm, steady voice that I had already given her exactly what she asked for, a life without me, and that I intended to respect her wish for independence until the very end. The finality of my words seemed to hit her with more force than the courtroom drama or the public humiliation ever could. I explained to her that the man she was calling was a person she had effectively killed with her betrayal, and that the executive she was speaking to now had no emotional connection to the house, the furniture, or the history they had shared. I told her that I would continue to fund the children's education and their needs through the trust, but that my personal responsibility to her had ended the moment she stood at that altar with a man she chose over her own integrity. She tried to scream that I was being cruel, that I was heartless for moving on so quickly, but I reminded her that she was the one who had celebrated my exile, and that she shouldn't be surprised when the person she threw away doesn't want to be picked back up. I hung up the phone and watched the rain, feeling a profound sense of tactical and emotional completion. Julia had wanted to be the star of her own movie, and she had finally achieved it. But she had forgotten that every tragedy needs a witness, and I was no longer interested in watching. Today, my life in Singapore is a testament to the power of a clean break and a focused mind. I have a thriving career, a circle of friends who respect the boundaries I have set, and a peace of mind that no amount of money or status could ever buy. I heard through the grapevine that Julia was forced to move into a small rental and take a job she once deemed beneath her just to stay ahead of the creditors. But she is no longer a factor in my reality. She is just a closed chapter in a book that has become a bestseller without her. I learned that some people only value the safety net when they are already falling, and that the best way to handle a person who treats your love like a cage is to open the door and let them fly straight into the storm they think they want. The silence of my luxury apartment is the greatest reward I have ever earned, and as I look at the vibrant city below, I know that the man Julia called pathetic is the only one who truly won the war she started. I am home, I am free, and the story of Julia and I is finally beautifully finished. I am curious, which part of the country are you listening this story to, and did you know that nearly 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Check out our next video about a shocking Reddit cheating story where a husband discovers the truth about his cheating wife.